I lost everything at 40. Wife left me for my boss. Parents kicked me out. Then I found something that flipped my world upside down. You know, they say life hits you like a freight train when you least expect it. But in my case, it was more like a sledgehammer to the gut on a cold November morning. I'm Andrew Miller, and this is a story of how I lost everything I thought mattered, only to find out what actually did. Let me take you back to where it all started. Big Walnut, Ohio. Population 3,247. On a good day, when everyone's cousin is visiting. I always said Big Walnut was like an old, cozy blanket your grandma knitted for decades, a little faded around the edges, but so familiar and warm you never wanted to let it go. Picture this. Soybean fields stretching toward the horizon, turning golden under the autumn sun like nature's own treasure map. The air carried that perfect mix of fresh-baked bread from Molly's Bakery downtown, and what my dad called the aroma of freedom, gasoline and motor oil drifting from garages where honest men fixed honest problems with their hands. Every evening, you'd hear the symphony of small-town America, the creak of old porch swings where neighbors actually talked to each other, kids laughing in backyards that weren't fenced off like prison yards, crickets starting their nightly concert just as the streetlights flickered on. My dad used to say, "Andrew, there are only two real smells in life, gasoline and fresh bread. Both of them are about freedom, son." I was raised by two of the most genuine people you'd ever meet. Ronald Miller, my dad, was a mechanic whose hands always smelled like motor oil and patience. The man could diagnose a car problem just by listening to the engine cough. My mom, Laura, ran a small bakery stand at the farmer's market. Her kitchen always smelled like love and cinnamon, and she had this way of making everyone feel like family with just one bite of her apple pie. They taught me something most kids today never learn. Dad would say, "Rust can eat through metal, Andrew, but it'll never eat through your will." Mom would add, "And honey, a smile and a free sample of apple pie is the best marketing in the world." I was probably the only kid in Ohio who could tear apart a carburetor before I learned to tie my shoes properly. Spent most afternoons in Dad's garage, watching him work magic on engines that sounded like they were dying. He'd hand me tools and explain everything like I was his business partner, not just some 7-year-old with grease-stained fingers. "See this here, Andrew? This carburetor is like a heart. It needs the right mix of air and fuel to keep everything pumping. Too much of either one and the whole system fails." Little did I know he was teaching me more than just car repair. Weekends meant helping Mom at the farmer's market. I learned that people don't just buy food. They buy stories, memories, connections. Mrs. Henderson would come every Saturday morning for her usual dozen dinner rolls, but really she just wanted someone to listen to her talk about her late husband's garden. Old Pete would pretend he was just browsing, but he always ended up buying a whole apple pie because Mom would ask about his grandkids. And then there was Grandma's secret recipe. Cinnamon rolls so perfect they made angels weep. Mom would only make them for special occasions, Easter, Christmas, or when someone in town was going through something tough. "This is our family treasure, Andrew," she'd whisper while mixing the dough. "Not for sale. Only for love." College? My universities were in the garage and at the market. Life was writing my diploma with every calloused hand and every satisfied customer. I did odd jobs around town after high school, fixing lawn mowers, helping farmers during harvest season, painting houses. I learned that the most important lessons aren't in textbooks. They're in the satisfaction of a job well done and the handshake that follows. But eventually, small towns make you dream bigger, or at least they make you think you should. That's when I found my way to Whitaker Financial Services. Now, this wasn't some slick corporate office with glass walls and fancy coffee machines. This was old-school America, a heavy oak desk that had witnessed decades of handshake deals, the smell of coffee that had been brewing since the Eisenhower era, and filing cabinets that actually held files instead of digital ghosts. Mr. Whitaker was a man from a different generation. He'd shake your hand and look you dead in the eye, and you knew right then whether he trusted you or not. He taught me that trust costs more than any interest rate, and that a man's word was the only collateral that really mattered. My job was simple. Help local farmers get loans for equipment, assist families with mortgages, be the bridge between people's dreams and the money that could make them real. It was at the annual autumn fair where I first saw Emily. She was working the first aid tent, bandaging some kids, scraped knee with the patience of a saint. Auburn hair catching the last rays of October sunshine, wearing scrubs even though she was volunteering on her day off. That's the kind of person she was, always taking care of someone. We got married in the little white church on Elm Street. The whole town showed up, because that's what small towns do. We rented a cozy house on Maple Street with a front porch perfect for evening conversations and dreams about the future. Our refrigerator was covered with little notes. Don't forget milk, or I love you, like tiny lighthouses in a sea of everyday life. We talked about kids, about growing old together, about building something that would outlast us both. Mr. Whitaker took me under his wing like the son he never had. I got promoted to senior consultant, which in a small operation like ours meant I got my own coffee mug and the responsibility to make sure the coffee pot wasn't empty. But it also meant trust, respect, and a salary that let Emily and I start thinking about buying instead of renting. One afternoon, while we were reviewing loan applications, Mr. Whitaker leaned back in his chair and said something that made my heart skip a beat. "Andrew, I've been doing this for 35 years. When I retire, I'd want someone like you at the helm. Someone who understands that we're not just moving money around. We're helping people build lives." I went home that night feeling like I was walking on air. Everything changed when Thomas Grayson showed up. Grayson was what you'd call a modernizer. Suddenly our old-fashioned office started smelling like espresso instead of coffee, and computers appeared that were brighter than our dreams and twice as complicated. He talked about efficiency, metrics, scalability, words that sounded important but felt cold. "This town is dying, Andrew," he said to me one day, gesturing at the window that looked out onto Main Street. "We either evolve or we get eaten alive by the bigger players." Maybe he had a point. Maybe I was just too stubborn to see it. The first crack started small. Emily began working longer shifts at the hospital, coming home exhausted and frustrated. I was putting in extra hours learning new computer systems and adapting to Grayson's new procedures. Our evening conversations turned into tired nods over reheated dinners. One night, Dad looked at me with those knowing eyes he developed after 50 years of living and said, "Andrew, remember this, busy isn't always good. Sometimes being busy is just an excuse not to look at what's hurting." I should have listened. I should have paid attention. But I was too busy climbing what I thought was a ladder when it was actually a house of cards. Emily started mentioning Tom from her work more often. Tom the doctor. Tom who understood the medical field. Tom who seemed to have answers for everything that was wrong with the healthcare system, our town, our life. I noticed but didn't really notice, if you know what I mean. The way you notice a cloud, but don't think about rain until you're already soaked. Our conversations became shorter. Our silences longer. The little notes on the refrigerator started disappearing, replaced by bills and appointment reminders. We were living in the same house, but traveling in different directions. Mr. Whitaker started talking about retirement more often. His arthritis was making it harder to shake hands the way he liked to, and he'd catch himself staring out the window more during the day. I kept thinking about what he'd said about wanting someone like me to take over. The possibility felt real, tangible, like something I could almost touch. But Grayson had different ideas. He talked about expanding, about bringing in outside investors, about turning our little family business into something bigger and more profitable. The word profitable started appearing in every conversation, like an unwelcome guest who wouldn't leave. I remember the exact moment I should have seen what was coming. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Grayson was on the phone with someone, speaking in numbers and percentages. I caught fragments. Redundant positions, cost-cutting measures, streamlining operations. When he hung up, he looked at me with the kind of smile a shark gives right before it bites. "Big changes coming, Andrew. Good changes. Efficient changes." I nodded and went back to my paperwork, but something in my gut twisted like a wrench on a stubborn bolt. Emily and I had our worst fight ever that week. She accused me of caring more about work than our marriage. I accused her of being unsupportive during a stressful time. We both said things that cut deeper than we intended, words that you can't take back once they're loose in the world. She slept in the guest room that night. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up, leaving only a note saying she was staying at her sister's for a few days to think things through. I should have gone after her. I should have fought for us. Instead, I went to work and buried myself in loan applications like they were life preservers. November arrived like an unwelcome relative, bringing cold winds and gray skies that matched my mood. The leaves had all fallen, leaving the trees looking like skeletons against the sky. There's something about November in Ohio that strips everything down to its essence. No hiding behind summer's warmth or autumn's colors. Just the truth, stark and unavoidable. That morning started like any other. I made coffee in our quiet kitchen, checked the weather, drove to work through streets that looked tired and worn. The office felt different somehow, smaller, colder, like the walls had moved closer together overnight. I found the envelope on my desk next to my half-empty coffee cup, plain white, official-looking, with my name typed across the front in letters that seemed to scream even though they were silent. I opened it with the kind of dread you feel when you already know the news is bad, but you have to hear it anyway. The word staff reduction hit me like a physical blow. I read it twice, then 3 times, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. I walked to Grayson's office feeling like my legs were made of lead. He was sitting behind his new computer, typing away like nothing had changed, like he hadn't just blown up my entire world with a form letter. When I knocked, he looked up with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this conversation and wasn't looking forward to it. "It's business, Andrew," he said before I could even speak. "Nothing personal. We're restructuring for efficiency." Efficiency. There was that word again, cold and sharp as a blade. I asked about Mr. Whitaker's promises, about my years of service, about the relationships I'd built with clients. Grayson just shrugged and went back to his computer screen. I packed my personal items into a cardboard box that seemed too small to hold 8 years of my life. A coffee mug Mom had given me, a photo of Emily and me at the county fair, a paperweight Mr. Whitaker had presented me when I made my first successful loan, pieces of a life that suddenly felt like someone else's story. Walking to my car, each step felt deliberate, heavy, like I was walking away from more than just a job. The November wind cut through my jacket, reminding me that winter was coming whether I was ready or not. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before starting the engine, staring at the building where I thought I had a future. Other employees were arriving for their normal day, carrying their coffee and their certainty that their world would still be intact when they went home. I envied them. Starting the car felt like acknowledging that this was really happening, that the life I'd been building for 8 years had just crumbled into dust, that everything I thought I knew about security and loyalty and hard work paying off was just a story I'd been telling myself. The drive home felt like traveling through a different universe. I kept thinking about how I was going to tell Emily, assuming she'd even want to hear it, about how we'd pay the mortgage without my income, about how I'd explain to Mom and Dad that their son, who they'd raised to believe in the American dream, had just been discarded like yesterday's newspaper. When I pulled into our driveway, the house looked smaller somehow, more fragile, like it knew what was coming and was already preparing to let us go. I walked through the front door and set my box of personal items on the kitchen table. The silence was so complete it seemed to have weight. No Emily. No notes on the refrigerator. Just me and the wreckage of what I thought was a solid life. I stood there in my empty kitchen, holding that termination letter, and realized that everything I'd built my identity around had just evaporated. The reliable job, the stable marriage, the predictable future. I stepped outside into the cold November morning, and the world I'd known crumbled around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. What came next? I had no idea. But something deep inside whispered with certainty. This is only the beginning. And what a beginning it was. Sitting in my car outside my own house, I couldn't bring myself to walk through that front door. Shock hit me first, then despair. Shame pressing down on my chest like a 200-pound weight. Fear of the emptiness that hung over my head like a storm cloud that just wouldn't break. I felt like a bird that had been shot out of the sky, tumbling toward the ground with no idea where I'd land or if I'd survive the impact. The house on Maple Street looked the same from the outside, but everything had changed. The white picket fence that once represented the American dream now felt like prison bars. The porch where Emily and I used to talk about our future seemed to mock me with its emptiness. I cursed that November morning, every tree dropping its leaves like my hopes falling to the ground, every gust of wind that reminded me winter was coming, and I had nowhere warm to go. I couldn't tell Emily right away. I just couldn't. The words felt too heavy, too final. So I pretended everything was normal for exactly one day. Went through the motions of getting dressed, drinking coffee, checking the mail, like playing house when the house is already on fire. The next morning, over breakfast that tasted like cardboard, I whispered the words that would change everything. 3 simple words that felt like swallowing broken glass. I got fired. Emily's face went through a whole slideshow of emotions. First surprise, like someone had just told her the sky was purple. Then sympathy, the kind you'd show a wounded animal. And then cold, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. Andrew, she said, setting down her coffee cup with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb. We need to talk. That's when she dropped the first bomb. She'd been unhappy for months. My job had consumed me, she said. I'd become a stranger living in our house. But the second bomb, that one nearly killed me. I've been seeing someone. 3 words. Just 3 words, and my entire world tilted sideways. Tom. Dr. Tom from the hospital. The same Tom she'd mentioned in passing. The Tom I thought was just a colleague. The Tom who apparently understood her in ways I never could. I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet, like standing on a trapdoor that someone had just opened. I want a divorce, Andrew, and I'm keeping the house. The house we dreamed of buying. The house where we planned to raise kids. The house that represented everything I thought we were building together. It's community property, she said, like she'd been rehearsing the words. And the savings account, too. I've already talked to a lawyer. My heart didn't just break. It shattered into a million tiny pieces that I knew I'd never be able to put back together, each piece cutting me from the inside as it fell. Emily packed her things that same day, watching her fold clothes that I'd helped her pick out. Seeing her pack photos of us like they were evidence of crime was harder than losing the job, because at least the job was just work. This was my life walking out the door in matching luggage. I'll be staying with Tom until we figure everything out, she said without looking at me. Tom. There was that name again, like a knife twisting in the wound. She left me with the bills, the mortgage payments, and a refrigerator that suddenly felt enormous and empty. Even the leftover Chinese takeout seemed to judge me. Lawyers. They're people who can turn your pain into stacks of paper and charge you by the hour for privilege. I couldn't afford a good one, so I got the kind who works out a strip mall next to a nail salon and a place that cashes paychecks. The divorce proceedings felt like watching someone else's life fall apart in slow motion. I signed papers that gave away years of my life with the stroke of a pen. Emily got the house, most of the savings, and my dignity. I walked away with my clothes, my pickup truck, and debt that followed me like a hungry dog. Standing outside that lawyer's office, I felt naked in the freezing wind. All I had left was my name, and even that felt like an empty sound echoing in a hollow space. I drove to my parents' house like a child running home after a nightmare. Except this nightmare was real, and there was no waking up from it. Dad answered the door in his old flannel shirt, the one with motor oil stains that no amount of washing could remove. Mom appeared behind him, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face already creased with worry before I said a word. I told them everything. The job, Emily, the divorce, the debts. Watched my mother's face crumble like old paper. Saw my father's shoulders sag under the weight of his son's failures. Andrew, Dad said, his voice heavy as lead, "Son, we're already struggling. Your mother's medical bills, my arthritis, we're just getting by on Social Security, and what little I make fixing cars for neighbors." Mom was crying now, soft tears that made me feel worse than any screaming match ever could. "We can't take on any more financial burden. Dad continued. You're a grown man. You have to figure this out yourself. Those words cut deeper than Emily's betrayal. Because parents are supposed to be your safety net, the place you can always come home to. Learning that even that net had holes in it was like falling through the last floor of your life. But you can stay in the garage, Mom said through her tears, until you get back on your feet. The garage, the same place where Dad had taught me about carburetors and life, where I'd learned that rust can eat through metal but never through your will. Now it would be my bedroom, my kitchen, my entire world reduced to the size of a 2-car garage. I moved in the next day with everything I owned fitting in the back of my pickup truck. 2 suitcases, a box of personal items, and a broken heart that felt heavier than all of it combined. The garage smelled like my childhood and my failure in equal measure. Motor oil and lost dreams. WD, 40 and wasted years. I set up a fold-out cot between Dad's workbench and Mom's old washing machine, hung a shower curtain for privacy, and called to home. My faithful companions in those dark days were empty cabinets, an empty refrigerator, and Max, my old dog who seemed to understand that I'd lost everything except his loyalty. Max was the only one who didn't judge me, didn't ask questions, didn't expect explanations. He'd just lay next to my cot every night, his warm body the only comfort in a world that had gone cold. Sleep became a stranger. Every night felt like wrestling with demons that wore the faces of everyone who'd let me down. Emily laughing with Tom, Grayson typing away at his computer while my life burned down, the lawyer counting his money while my marriage dissolved. Fear crept through my mind like spilled ink on white paper, spreading and staining everything it touched. Fear of the future, fear of failure, fear that this was it, that this garage would be the rest of my story. I'd lay there listening to the December wind rattle on the garage door, wondering how someone could fall so far so fast. Small towns have long memories and loud whispers. Walking through Big Walnut became an exercise in public humiliation. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations. Old clients looked at me with pity that burned worse than anger. At the grocery store, paying for generic cereal with food stamps, I ran into Mrs. Henderson from the farmer's market. She patted my arm with the kind of sympathy usually reserved for terminal patients. "Oh, honey," she said, loud enough for half the store to hear. "I heard about your troubles. Bless your heart." In the Midwest, bless your heart is code for your life is a disaster, and everyone knows it. Christmas came and went like a ghost I couldn't see but could feel watching me. Mom tried to make it normal, cooking a small turkey and setting an extra place at the table. But normal was a country I'd been exiled from, and I wasn't sure I'd ever find my way back. Dad gave me a car with $50 inside, money I knew he couldn't afford to give but couldn't afford not to. The gesture was kind and heartbreaking at the same time. I spent New Year's Eve in the garage, listening to fireworks in the distance and wondering if other people's fresh starts were as terrifying as mine felt. January brought snow that made the garage feel like a walk-in freezer. I applied for every job I could find. Gas stations, restaurants, retail stores. Most wouldn't even call me back. The few that did took one look at my resume, 8 years in finance, and decided I was overqualified for minimum wage work, overqualified for survival. Now, there's an American irony for you. The worst part wasn't the rejection letters or the empty bank account. It was the mirror. Every morning, I'd catch a glimpse of myself and wonder when I'd start looking like someone I didn't recognize. When had my eyes gotten so tired? When had my shoulders learned to carry defeat like a backpack full of rocks? I started avoiding mirrors altogether. If you don't look, maybe the person staring back isn't really you. But Max didn't care what I looked like. He'd still wag his tail when I walked in, still rest his head on my leg, when I sat on the cot, feeling sorry for myself. Dogs understand something about loyalty that humans seem to forget. February felt like the longest month in human history. I'd spend hours staring at Dad's tools hanging on their hooks, each one in its designated place, organized and purposeful. Unlike my life, which felt like a junk drawer that someone had shaken and dumped on the floor. I started wondering if this was rock bottom, or there were deeper levels of failure still waiting. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting. At least if this was the bottom, The only way to go was up. One afternoon, when cabin fever was making me feel like the garage walls were closing in, I decided to clean out some of the old junk that had accumulated in the corners over the years. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old car parts, projects Dad had started but never finished. That's when I found it, tucked behind a stack of yellowed newspapers and a broken lawnmower. An old wooden chest that I'd completely forgotten about. The chest was dusty, covered in cobwebs, but something about it felt warm and familiar, like finding an old friend you'd lost touch with years ago. I brushed off the dust and opened the heavy lid. The hinges creaked like they were whispering secrets. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, were things I hadn't seen since I was a boy. Old photographs of my grandfather in his army uniform, looking young and serious. A purple heart medal that caught the dim garage light. And underneath all of that, something that made my hands shake. A leather-bound notebook filled with my grandfather's careful handwriting. Recipes. Not just any recipes. Detailed instructions for breads, pies, pastries. The kind of baking that told stories and created memories. My grandfather had been a baker before the war, and apparently he'd never stopped being one in his heart. Page after page of notes, techniques, family secrets that had been hiding in this garage all along. At the bottom of the chest, I found a folded letter with my name on it in Grandpa's familiar script. My hands trembled as I opened it. Andrew, it read, if you're reading this, then life has probably knocked you down harder than you thought possible. That's okay, son. Getting knocked down doesn't make you weak. Staying down does. These recipes aren't just about baking. They're about rising. Everything rises, Andrew. Bread, hopes, men, but you have to give them the right conditions and time. I sat there in that cold garage, holding my grandfather's letter, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope, not the desperate kind that grabs at anything floating by, but the steady kind that plants roots and grows slowly. It was the first ray of sunlight breaking through storm clouds that had been choking my sky for too long. I didn't know what it meant yet, didn't understand how recipes for bread could save a man's life. But I felt it in my bones, the way you feel spring coming before you see the first green shoots pushing through the snow. This was my chance. Maybe not just a chance, but a lifeline thrown to me from the past, from a grandfather who'd survived his own storms and left me a map for surviving mine. That lifeline came with a story I'd never heard before. My grandfather wasn't just a war veteran who fixed clocks and told terrible jokes at family dinners. He was a baker, a real baker who understood that life was like making a perfect pie. You needed the right ingredients, patience, and a little bit of love to make it work. Inside that dusty chest were treasures that would change everything. Not gold or money, but something more valuable. Knowledge passed down through generations, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting like instructions for a new life. The leather-bound notebook felt warm in my hands, like it had been waiting for me all these years. Page after page of recipes for old American classics. Apple pies that could make grown men weep, dinner rolls soft as clouds, and cinnamon pastries that smelled like childhood memories. But these weren't just ingredients and measurements. They were stories. Each recipe came with notes about his youth, his dreams, his vision of an America where hard work and good food brought people together around kitchen tables. At the top of the first page, in faded blue ink, he'd written something that hit me like lightning. Andrew, if you're reading this, life has probably knocked you down harder than you thought possible. That's okay, son. Getting knocked down doesn't make you weak. Staying down does. I spent the next 3 days reading every word, studying every technique, imagining my grandfather's hands mixing the same dough that would soon coat my own fingers. He wrote about rising, how bread needs time and the right conditions to become what it's meant to be. Everything rises, Andrew. One note read, bread, hopes, men, but you have to give them the right conditions and time. It was like he was speaking directly to me from beyond the grave, telling me exactly what I needed to hear when I needed to hear it most. My first attempt at baking was a disaster that would have made Gordon Ramsay weep for different reasons. My little makeshift kitchen and garage turned into a battlefield where flour flew through the air like snow in a blizzard, and the oven alternated between crematorium and refrigerator. I burned the first batch so badly that Max whined and left the garage. Even my loyal dog had standards. The second batch was raw in the middle and charcoal on the outside, like I'd invented some new form of culinary torture. I threw it in the trash and seriously considered giving up before I'd really started. But then I remembered Grandpa's words. Don't be afraid of dirty hands, Andrew. Flour isn't a problem. It's a promise. So I kept trying, batch after batch, failure after failure, until my hands were permanently stained with flour and my garage smelled like a bakery that had been hit by a tornado. Mom would peek in occasionally, offering encouragement and trying not to laugh at the mess I created. "Honey," she said one afternoon, surveying the disaster zone that used to be organized storage space, "your grandfather would be proud. He always said the best bakers are the ones who aren't afraid to fail." After about 2 weeks of disasters that could have ended up on a cooking show called When Baking Goes Wrong, something clicked. Maybe it was muscle memory from watching Mom bake all those years, or maybe Grandpa's spirit was guiding my hands. But suddenly, I pulled a tray of apple turnovers from the oven that actually looked like food. They weren't perfect. The edges were a little uneven, and one side was darker than the other. But they smelled like heaven and tasted like victory. I took a bite and nearly cried. Not because they were amazing, they were good, but not great. I cried because for the first time in months, I created something instead of just watching my life fall apart. Dad wandered into the garage drawn by the smell, took one bite, and his eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "Andrew," he said, flour still dusting his mustache, "these taste like your grandmother's. She's been gone 15 years, but I can taste her kitchen in every bite." That's when I knew I had something special. Not just a recipe, but a connection to something bigger than myself. A link to family, tradition, and the kind of American dream that's built one satisfied customer at a time. 2 weeks later, I loaded my pickup truck with every pie, pastry, and roll I could bake and drove to the Saturday farmer's market. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely set my folding table and handwritten sign that read, "Grandpa's Oven, fresh baked with love." I felt like an actor on opening night, terrified and exhilarated at the same time. The first hour was brutal. People walked by, glanced at my humble setup squeeze between the tomato lady and the guys selling homemade soap, and kept walking. I started wondering if this was just another failure waiting to happen. Then something magical occurred. The morning breeze picked up and carried the aroma of my fresh-baked apple turnovers across the entire market, like an invisible hand beckoning people toward my table. Mrs. Peterson, who used to buy insurance for me back in my banking days, stopped dead in her tracks and followed her nose straight to my setup. "Andrew Miller?" she said, like she was seeing a ghost. "What on earth are you doing here?" I explained about the recipes, about starting over, about trying to build something from nothing. She listened with the kind patience that small-town people reserve for neighbors going through rough patches. Then she bought 6 turnovers and a whole apple pie. "These smell exactly like my mother used to make," she said, handing me $20 like she was investing in the stock market. "If they taste half as good as they smell, you're going to do just fine." They tasted better. Word spread through the market like wildfire. By noon, I had a line of people waiting to try the new baker who'd appeared out of nowhere. Old customers from the bank, neighbors who remember me as the kid who helped his mom at the same market 20 years ago, young families looking for treats that reminded them of simpler times. One customer, a guy about my age wearing a coffee-stained apron, bought 3 different pastries and asked for my card. "I own the corner cafe on Main Street," he said. "Been looking for someone to supply fresh pastries for months. These are incredible." His name was Mike, and he became my first real business partner. Not the kind who wants to modernize and optimize everything, but the kind who understands that good food brings people together, and that's worth more than any spreadsheet can measure. But success breeds jealousy, especially in small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business. Bob Mitchell, who'd been running Bob's Bakery for 30 years, didn't appreciate the new competition. I was packing up my remaining pastries at the end of my 3rd Saturday when he walked by my table. Bob was built like a bulldog and had the personality to match, all bark and bite when he felt his territory was threatened. He looked at my grandpa's oven sign and snorted like he'd just smelled something rotten. "New fancy stuff," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see how long this lasts when people get tired of paying premium prices for amateur hour." I just smiled and kept packing, but something cold settled in my stomach. This wasn't just about selling pastries anymore. This was about survival, about proving that someone could fall down and get back up, about showing that the American dream was still alive even in a world that seemed designed to crush it. Bob represented everything I was fighting against. The idea that if you're not first, you're last, and that newcomers should know their place and stay in it. But I wasn't the same man who'd been laid off 6 months ago. That guy would have backed down, apologized, maybe even quit. This version of me had been forged in the fire of losing everything and had nothing left to lose. I decided to fight back the only way I knew how, with kindness and quality. I'd always believed that goodness was like a boomerang. The more you throw out into the world, the more comes back to you. So I started giving away free samples to anyone who looked hungry, setting aside pastries for the homeless shelter, and making sure elderly customers never left empty-handed. Mrs. Chun, who lived alone and barely got by on Social Security, became a regular customer who never paid full price but always got full value. I'd slip an extra roll into her bag when she wasn't looking, pretending it was a mistake. That generosity came back to me in ways I never expected. Mrs. Chin told her grandson about my pastries. Her grandson happened to be a food blogger with 10,000 followers who wrote a review that brought customers from 3 counties over. The homeless shelter director became a customer who ordered dozens of day-old pastries at cost, which led to catering requests for community events, which led to standing orders from 2 more coffee shops in neighboring towns. Every act of kindness rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves I couldn't see but could definitely feel. 3 months in, I was making enough money to move out of my parents' garage and rent a small apartment above Mike's Cafe. It wasn't much, 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in, but it was mine. The night I moved in, I sat on my second-hand couch eating leftover cinnamon rolls and looking out at Main Street, the same street where I used to walk to work in a suit and tie, carrying other people's dreams in a briefcase. Now I walk the same street in flour-dusted jeans, carrying my own dreams in my hands, 1 pastry at a time. I started thinking about branding, about making this more than just a guy selling pastries at the farmer's market. Grandpa's oven felt right. It honored my grandfather's memory while telling a story that people could connect with. I found a vintage photo of Grandpa in his army uniform and had it printed on simple brown boxes that made my pastries look like treasures from a bygone era. Not just a brand, but a piece of American history you could taste. Every box carried a little story, a connection to something larger than just flour and sugar and butter. It was about tradition, family, and the kind of values that used to hold communities together. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. Dad was right when he said that even the best roads have potholes. The health department showed up with clipboards and attitudes, demanding to see permits I didn't know I needed and certifications that cost money I barely had. Getting a food service license in Ohio requires jumping through more hoops than training circus animals. Background checks, inspections, fees that multiply like rabbits, and forms that needed forms to explain the forms. I spent my entire profit from 1 month just on paperwork and permits, but it was worth it to be legitimate, official, legal. The hardest part was getting startup capital. Banks look at a guy who was recently unemployed and divorced like he's carrying a contagious disease. My credit was shot, my collateral was non-existent, and my business plan was written on napkins from Mike's Cafe. I ended up taking a microloan secured by my pickup truck, the same truck that carried me through the worst period of my life, and was now literally carrying my future. If the business failed, I'd lose my transportation, my delivery method, and my last connection to the man I used to be. But sometimes you have to risk everything to save anything. Just when the pressure was getting overwhelming, help came from an unexpected source. Tom Bradley, a farmer who used to get equipment loans through Whitaker Financial, approached me at the market one Saturday morning. "Andrew," he said, shaking my hand with callous fingers that knew real work, "I heard about what happened with your job. Heard about what you're building here, too. He bought a dozen dinner rolls and handed me an envelope. "Consider this an investment," he said. "Not in your business, but in your character. I always trusted you with my money when you worked at the bank. Now I'm trusting you with mine as a baker." Inside the envelope was a check for $5,000 and a note that said, "Your pie isn't just a pie, Andrew. It's a promise of quality, and I believe in promises." I almost cried right there in front of the whole market. Not from gratitude, though I was grateful. I cried because someone believed in me when I was still learning to believe in myself. That investment let me buy better equipment, more ingredients, and the kind of insurance that keeps small businesses from becoming big disasters. More importantly, it gave me something I'd lost months ago, confidence that the future was something to build toward instead of something to survive. By late summer, I was supplying 3 coffee shops, catering 2 weddings a month, and had a waiting list for my grandmother's secret cinnamon rolls, the ones Mom finally agreed to let me make for special occasions. I closed my first full day of profitable sales and sat on my parents' front porch, eating the last warm apple turnover while looking up at the endless Ohio sky. Every star looked like a tiny lighthouse of hope, guiding me towards something I couldn't quite see yet, but could definitely feel. For the first time in months, I didn't feel empty inside. I felt full, not just with good food, but with possibility, with purpose, with a taste of a future that I was creating one pastry at a time. This was the taste of my new beginning. That new beginning led me down a path I never could have imagined. 6 months after my first successful day at the farmer's market, I was standing in front of a vacant storefront on Main Street, keys in my hand, staring at what would become my first real bakery. The smell of fresh bread that would soon fill this space was going to be better than any cologne ever invented. I was about to transform this empty shell into a place where magic happened daily, where flour and dreams mixed together to create something that fed both bodies and souls. The building was small but perfect, just enough room for a commercial kitchen, a display case, and maybe 6 tables where people could sit and remember what it felt like to slow down. I hired Jenny, a local teenager who needed a part-time job to save for college, and Mrs. Helen, a retired school teacher who'd always dreamed of learning to bake professionally. Mrs. Helen's eyes lit up like Christmas morning when she first touched the commercial mixer. Watching her knead dough was like watching someone rediscover their youth, her weathered hands moving with surprising grace as she shaped dinner rolls that looked like little works of art. On opening day, there was a line stretching halfway down the block. These weren't just customers. They were neighbors who wanted to support one of their own. People who understood that small businesses are the backbone of small towns. Success breeds its own problems, and mine multiplied faster than rabbits in springtime. Demand grew like bread dough on a warm day. I couldn't keep up. My pies were showing up in every coffee shop in Big Walnut, then spreading to neighboring towns like a delicious epidemic. I signed contract with coffee shop chains, bought a gleaming new commercial oven that cost more than my old annual salary, and traded my faithful pickup truck for a delivery van with Grandpa's oven painted on the side in vintage lettering. My old pickup sat in my parents' driveway like a retired racehorse that had earned its rest, still proud but no longer needed for the daily grind. But as Dad always said, even the smoothest roads have potholes, and mine were more like craters. The health department showed up unannounced with clipboards and attitudes, demanding to see documentation I didn't know existed. My landlord decided he wanted to triple the rent because business was good. Equipment broke down at the worst possible moments, usually right before major orders. The bank initially refused my loan application, looking at me like I was asking to borrow money to buy lottery tickets. But then David Whitaker Jr. walked into my life like an answer to a prayer I didn't know I was praying. He was a young lawyer with his father's integrity and his generation's understanding of how business really worked. "My father always believed in you, Andrew," he said, shaking my hand with the same firm grip I remembered from his dad. He saw something in people that others missed. I see it too. David helped me restructure my loan application, navigate the maze of small business regulations, and secure credit terms that wouldn't strangle my cash flow. For the first time since starting this journey, I had a financial advisor who saw potential instead of problems. It felt like having Mr. Whitaker back in my corner, fighting for the little guy against a system designed to favor the big players. Not everyone was thrilled about my success. Bob Mitchell, owner of Bob's Bakery, had been watching my rise with the enthusiasm of someone watching his house burn down. When customers started choosing my apple pies over his 3-generation family recipes, he decided to declare war. Bob accused me of stealing his recipes, claiming I must have somehow gotten hold of his grandmother's secret formulas. The accusation was ridiculous, but in a small town, rumors spread faster than butter on warm toast. We ended up in mediation, sitting across from each other like gunfighters at high noon, except instead of pistols we had lawyers, and instead of a dusty street we had a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and legal fees. I brought Grandpa's leather-bound notebook, every yellow page a testament to my family's baking heritage. The mediator flipped through decades of handwritten recipes, notes about technique, and personal stories that couldn't be faked or copied. Some things can't be duplicated. The mediator finally said, closing the notebook with respect, the soul of a recipe, the story behind it, the love that goes into it, those are irreplaceable. Bob's case crumbled like a poorly made pie crust. He walked out muttering about lawyers and fairness, but I felt no satisfaction in his defeat. Competition was healthy, but this had been about something deeper. The fear that success was a zero-sum game where one person's victory meant another's defeat. The victory celebration was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. I was in the bakery late one evening, prepping dough for the next day, when someone knocked on the glass door. I looked up to see a figure I'd hoped never to encounter again. Emily. She looked different, tired, hollow around the eyes, like someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for too long. The confident woman who'd left me for a better life had been replaced by someone who looked lost and uncertain. She'd seen my success on social media. She said, watch from a distance as her ex-husband built something meaningful from nothing. Her new life with Tom hadn't turned out to be the fairy tale she'd imagined. I made a mistake, Andrew, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom and I, it's not working. The money, the lifestyle, none of it feels real. I keep thinking about what we had, what I threw away. She asked about coming back, about reconciliation, about second chances. When that didn't work, she hinted about needing financial help, about how my success could solve her problems. I listened with the patience I'd learned from kneading dough. Sometimes you have to let things work themselves out in their own time. But my answer was firm. Emily, some doors, once they're closed, need to stay closed, especially when they lead backward instead of forward. Success gave me the power to help others the way I'd been helped during my darkest days. I started a Pay It Forward program for veterans and single mothers, offering free meals and job training to people who needed a second chance. It was more than just giving away pastries. It was offering hope, dignity, and the message that America still had room for people who'd stumbled but were ready to get back up. The genuine smiles I received in return were better advertising than any billboard could provide. Mrs. Rodriguez, a single mother of 3 who'd lost her job at the factory, became my assistant manager within a year. Her transformation from desperation to confidence reminded me daily why this work mattered beyond profit margins. The phone call from Mom came on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice carrying emotions I hadn't heard since childhood. Pride mixed with something that sounded like apology. Andrew, honey, your father and I, we need to talk to you about something. They'd been watching their son's journey from failure to success, and they realized they'd let fear make them smaller when I needed them to be bigger. They apologized for not being able to help financially, for making me feel alone when I was already drowning. We always believed in you, Mom said through tears. Sometimes believing isn't enough if you don't show it when it counts. I forgave them because parents are just people, and people make mistakes when they're scared. Their love had always been the foundation I stood on. Even when I couldn't feel it holding me up, they started helping at the bakery. Dad's mechanical skills proving invaluable for equipment maintenance. Mom's market experience helping with customer relations. Our family had that familiar smell again. Fresh bread mixed with motor oil, but now it was the aroma of success born from honest work. Watching Dad teach Jenny how to fix the temperamental mixer, while Mom showed Mrs. Helen the secrets of perfect pie crust, made me realize that some things are worth more than money. Some things are worth everything. 18 months after opening my first bakery, I signed a lease on a second location in the next town over. The demand was there, the systems were in place, and I had a team I trusted to help manage the expansion. Letters started arriving from entrepreneurs in other states, asking about franchise opportunities. Grandpa's Oven was becoming more than just a bakery. It was a brand that represented something people hungered for in an increasingly impersonal world. Investors who would return my calls 2 years ago were now lined up with checkbooks, eager to be part of what they called the next big thing in artisanal food service. But life has a twisted sense of humor, and sometimes it delivers your past and future to your doorstep on the same day. That's what happened when David Whitaker Jr. walked into my bakery with news that would complete the circle of my journey. Thomas Grayson's modernization efforts at the old Whitaker Financial had backfired spectacularly. The company was hemorrhaging money, losing clients, and facing bankruptcy. They wanted to hire me as a financial consultant to help save what was left of the business. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. The man who'd fire me now needed me to save him. I smiled and politely declined, not out of vindictiveness, but out of understanding. Some bridges are meant to be burned, not rebuilt. Some chapters of your life are meant to stay closed so new ones can be written. Some debts can't be paid with money, I thought as I watched David leave with my refusal. And some victories aren't worth celebrating. The real victory was knowing I'd moved beyond the need for revenge, beyond the desire to prove anything to people who'd never really see me anyway. But the past wasn't finished with me yet. Emily hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit claiming she was entitled to a share of my business because we'd still been married when I started baking. The claim was as flimsy as tissue paper, but it still had to be fought. I hired Sarah Whitaker, David's sister and one of the best family law attorneys in the state. She presented documentation showing that my first commercial sale occurred 3 months after our divorce was finalized, that my business was built entirely with post-divorce assets. The judge dismissed Emily's claim with the kind of finality that closes books forever. Emily agreed to a small settlement that was more about dignity than dollars. This is the last piece of bitterness I have to swallow, I told myself as I signed the final papers, and I'm going to do it with grace. Watching Emily walk out of that courthouse, I felt sorry for her. Not pity, but genuine sadness for someone who traded something real for something that glittered but wasn't gold. She'd gotten what she thought she wanted, and discovered it wasn't what she needed. I, on the other hand, had lost what I thought I needed and found what I actually wanted. 2 years later, I was able to buy my parents the house they'd always dreamed of, a little place on the outskirts of town with a big kitchen for Mom and a workshop for Dad. Watching them explore their new home like kids on Christmas morning was worth every 18-hour day I'd worked to get there. Andrew, Mom said, hugging me in her new kitchen, "We always knew you'd find your way. Sometimes a person just needs a good push to remember who they really are." Dad nodded, already planning improvements to the workshop. The boy who could fix carburetors was always going to figure out how to fix his life. The final encounter with Emily came by accident, as these things often do. I was grabbing coffee at a shop that sold my pastries when she walked in, looking older but more peaceful than I'd seen her in years. We talked for a few minutes, the kind of careful conversation you have with someone who used to matter more than air, but now feels like a pleasant stranger. She admitted she'd been blinded by the promise of easy money and security, that she confused comfort with happiness. "You look happy, Andrew," she said as she prepared to leave. "Really happy, not just successful." "Some books are better not to reread, Emily," I replied, "but I hope you write yourself a good ending." 5 years after that cold November morning when I thought my life was over, I stood at the podium of my flagship bakery's grand reopening, looking out at a crowd that included family, friends, employees, veterans I'd helped, and community members who'd supported me from the beginning. This wasn't my courtroom victory or my bank success. This was something bigger. The moment when you realize you've not just rebuilt your life, but built something better than what you lost. I thank my grandfather, whose recipes had passed the torch of family tradition. I thank my parents, who taught me that work and love were the same thing. I thank the community that had believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. This is the American dream, I said, looking out at faces that reflected my own journey back from despair. Not the version they sell in movies, but the real one. The one where you fall down, get back up, and discover that failing isn't the opposite of succeeding. It's the foundation of it. The applause felt like validation, but more importantly, it felt like belonging. I belonged to this community, and it belonged to me in a way that only comes from mutual investment and shared struggle. Standing there, I realized that betrayal had become the catalyst for my greatest transformation. When life knocked me down, I'd had two choices: stay down or build something incredible from the wreckage. The most valuable thing I'd gained wasn't money or success. It was trust. The trust of customers who knew my pastries were made with integrity. The trust of employees who knew they were valued. The trust of community that had watched me fall and cheered when I rose. And maybe most importantly, I'd learned to trust myself again. As the evening wound down and the last customers headed home with boxes of fresh pastries, I walked through my bakery, touching the equipment that had become extensions of my hands, breathing in the aroma of success that smelled suspiciously like happiness. I picked up Grandpa's old notebook from its place of honor behind the counter and ran my fingers over the worn leather cover. Looking out the window at the town that had once felt like a prison but now felt like home, I watched the aroma of fresh bread drift onto the evening air like a promise. A promise that no matter how dark things get, morning always comes. And if you're willing to do the work, if you're willing to rise like bread dough in a warm kitchen, you can create something beautiful from the simplest ingredients: life, hope, flour, and love. Sometimes that's all you need to bake something extraordinary. The aroma of fresh bread drifted onto Main Street like a beacon of hope, reminding anyone who smelled it that new beginnings are always possible. And sometimes the best chapters of your life are the ones you write after you think the story is over. This was my story, filled with the aroma of fresh baking,